Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, what robots does the community need? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week's episode is all about communities and why it's so important to involve them in the development of new robotics technologies. But first, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to Robot Talk through your favourite podcast provider. It really helps the podcast and means you'll be the first to hear the latest episodes. Another way to find out about new episodes is our email newsletter, which you can sign up to on our website by going to robottalk.org. And don't forget to enter our competition for a chance to win your very own Robot Talk t-shirt. Our winner for March was Sangeet Joseph, and we'll be selecting another lucky winner at the end of April. For more information about the competition and how to enter, check out robottalk.org. So, without further ado, let's get on with this week's interview. I recently had a great conversation with Ella Maule from the Bristol Robotics Lab, all about community robotics and the social side of robot design. This week, I'm talking to Ella Maule, a PhD student in ethical and sustainable futures at the Bristol Robotics Lab, who's researching community robotics, which centres communities in robotic technology innovation. Hi Ella, lovely to have you on the podcast.
It's lovely to be here.
So your PhD is exploring the concept of community robotics. So what is community robotics all about?
So community robotics is a proposed new field of study within robotics. It centres communities as users and stakeholders in robotic autonomous system innovation.
Okay.
Community robotics recognises communities have different needs and priorities than individual consumers, and it explores how we can create robotic technologies that meet these needs, work in service of community, and perhaps thinking beyond the purely economic value and benefits, instead prioritising things like social value.
Okay. So you mentioned it's a new field. How new are we talking?
Very. So my work is building off the work of one other researcher who has grounded a concept of robotics for community or robots for community in the dimension of social robotics. But for me, my work is building on that and looking to expand that to the whole field more broadly, because through my reading and through my research, I have recognised that the values and the methods that we use to innovate ultimately have an effect on the technology that comes out the other side. And that is true of dexterous robotics or swarm robotics. And so if we can recognise communities throughout our whole kind of innovation ecosystem, we can create technology that works for more people.
Yeah, and that really taps into, I guess, a lot of current concerns about the way technology is going and whether or not it's really being designed with our best interests at heart.
Definitely. It's a real and very fair concern. Robotics, even though it's been, I guess, around for decades now, it's still fairly young as a discipline. There's low kind of technology diffusion, low kind of accessibility for people. Many people don't have much exposure to the technology. So centering the values of people, and in my case, centering the values of communities, hopefully kind of helps people in recognizing that technologies can work for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've talked to some of my previous guests about like user-centric design and, the importance of involving end users in the robotic design process, but really focused as kind of individuals rather than communities. So why do you think it's important to include that sort of that larger unit of communities within the process of robotics design?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of user-centric methodologies have kind of emerged over the last, I guess, kind of 40, 50 years. it's important to include communities in the process of robotic design because technology and society are so kind of deeply interconnected and mutually shaping. In the way we design technology, we design the behaviors that people have around them and people have with them. And as I've alluded to, the values and needs that drive design and our research and innovation are linked to those outcomes.
Yeah.
And robotic systems have huge potential to create widespread change in society and I guess to the planet that we all share, and to ensure that the outcomes of this work is equitable and the benefits and impacts are felt equitably. We need a kind of socially responsive innovation ecosystem that serves everyone. And communities, or including communities as stakeholders, I think is one way that we can do this.
Yeah. So how do the needs of a community potentially differ from the needs of an individual?
That's a really good question. I guess there's a couple of ways. Firstly, communities are kind of multi-dimensional, complex and dynamic systems, and they exist within, I guess, a network of other communities. And as such, they're kind of irreducible to the individual interactions that co-create this feeling of community or the benefits that are felt by community. And communities, their needs are driven by the needs of their members, and those members change, but they're also driven by the social, economic and environmental landscape in which they sit.
Yeah.
And their shared feelings, they're not individualistic. They are communal and community focused.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like that sense of community is something that maybe has been lost a little bit nowadays compared to perhaps, previous generations where there was really much more of a sense of community, for a lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think community now just looks different than it has before. And kind of a really clear example of that is kind of the rise of the internet and the World Wide Web, and us being able to foster and create community in ways that we hadn't been able to create and foster before.
Yeah.
The commonality in a community can be varied, and it can be kind of action focused or place focused, common interest. And this kind of, I guess, is another reason why community is so different from individual, is it's so diverse in its goals, in its aims, in what it aims to create for its members.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, when you say the phrase community, I tend to think of your neighborhood that you live in. But of course, you're right. There's all these other communities. And I guess there's a degree of kind of intersectionality there where one person can be a member of many different communities.
Exactly. That's that kind of complex multidimensionality. And when you have this network of people whose needs are being met and they're contributing to the needs of others, it's really hard to distill it down to that single interaction between me and another member of the community. It really is larger than itself.
Yeah.
More than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to say. So, I mean, it seems like it's hard enough to engage individual users in kind of the design process, like just logistically in terms of finding those people, recruiting them having the time to take part. It feels like that's an order of magnitude more complicated when it's a community. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think you're probably correct. I am still early on in my journey of exploring this new concept.
Yeah.
But what's important for me is that the work or the methodologies and the tools that emerge from this new discipline work both in service of the communities, but also in service of roboticists and technologists. And that's definitely going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
I think the tools that will allow roboticists to best understand the communities they're looking to work with will be different from the ones that you engage with when you work with individuals.
Yeah.
But hopefully, by working with these people, the technologies that come out of these will work for them, and there will be a mutual benefit from this effort. And the benefits aren't just to communities, but for roboticists, where you're kind of centering a new set of values and you're looking to create technology that delivers on different purposes to meet different aims and goals. You open up a new set of technologies, a new series of avenues to explore in the way we generate technology, hopefully for the benefit of kind of more people and in new ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds fascinating, if very challenging to study. As I kind of hinted at earlier, obviously, like media coverage and pop culture often portrays a lot of fear relating to robotics technology, some of which might be a little bit kind of overblown, and some of it is probably quite reasonable. Do you think that that kind of fear is something that's been mirrored in feelings that are expressed to you by the communities you've interacted with?
Fear is definitely one of the feelings that has emerged during discussions while I've been exploring this concept.
Yeah.
But so too have, I guess, skepticism and trepidation, but also excitement and interest. And I guess the diverse feelings that are being presented are what roboticists kind of need to harness and use to better direct the way we communicate and communicate with the public. Because ultimately the outcome of the work that we do will affect everybody. But I think perhaps these feelings are rightly so. People, including me sometimes, feel this fear. This work has been around for decades, but there's still very little of it out in the world. And it can definitely feel like the needs of the many are not being reflected in the way that we create technology.
Yeah. I guess, though, this fear is something that's been around, throughout human history, right?
Definitely.
There's always been anxiety and fear relating to new technology, and how it's going to affect people's lives.
Definitely. I think kind of similar fears existed and emerged when kind of motor vehicles became a reality, and when you had like sewing computers became a thing, and the world will change. And that's something that I think is really important for technologists to continually reflect on. But by more closely working with and considering larger populations as stakeholders in the work we produce, we can perhaps kind of co-create this future that is beneficial to more people, but equitably beneficial.
Yeah. And I mean, hopefully, being part of the design process might help people feel less afraid of the robotic future.
Definitely. And I think that's a really important part of this fear, perhaps, because it's a complicated discipline. As roboticists, we're often experts in a very narrow part of the field, but we are lucky enough to have the language to talk about our fears. Technology literacy is a really important tool in the way we communicate with each other about our future. And there's definitely a need to improve the technology literacy of the population more broadly so that everyone can be involved in these discussions and feel empowered and that they have power in the outcome of this work.
Yeah, definitely. So, robotics is naturally a very interdisciplinary area. And it seems like community robotics requires an even more diverse skill set, and often skills in areas that maybe aren't traditionally represented in robotics. So, can you talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary nature of your research, and how you're developing that really quite unique skill set?
Yeah, you definitely picked up on a really important element of community robotics. And my work so far has kind of demonstrated a need for a perhaps new, radically participatory and transdisciplinary approach and methodology. Participatory methodologies exist in robotics, like human robot interaction and social robotics both employ participatory methodologies, but they are often very centered on the individual.
Yeah.
And for community robotics and to design for communities, like a deeper understanding of community is really important. And you're correct. It's really about bridging that gap between technologists and the social sciences and the people who these technologies will serve. And kind of a broad range of disciplines have definitely emerged to me as being really critical in doing this. Kind of social sciences, definitely, but also kind of design and design research, design philosophy, this whole spectrum of knowledge and research that kind of has emerged to me, and I continue to explore it and understand what that looks like. I'm very lucky in that as a student at the Bristol Robotics Lab, I'm a student of both the University of Bristol and the University of the West of England, and both of them being excellent in their research offerings, but also in their skill development programs. And I've been lucky enough to kind of engage with and meet people across this kind of spectrum of research and kind of engage with the resources and skill building that they have available to them.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Often there's kind of a bit of a language barrier between different research fields, especially when they're so far removed. Do you find that it's kind of hard to relate concepts in one field to those in another?
Definitely. I think that's exactly, you've kind of perfectly articulated some of the barriers and some of the difficulties, I think, in engaging with this kind of work, and whether it's kind of the community robotics aspect that I'm looking at, or if you're someone who's looking to create these participatory methodologies. In engineering and technology, we're kind of rooted in these traditional natural science and engineering philosophies and investigative practices, and those are sometimes quite, but also sometimes very different from the philosophies and practices of these social sciences. And we look at our research in very different ways, and bridging that language gap has been a real challenge for me, and I'm still learning. I think I will probably endlessly continue to learn kind of how to communicate across these research disciplines. But bit by bit, you can kind of begin to build a little translator that helps you kind of direct your language towards one set of expertise or direct your language towards another. But there is a lot of commonality, and I think you're right, it's the language. We just talk about things in slightly different ways often, even if we're agreeing.
Yeah, definitely. And then we had an audience question submitted by Simon Carter via our website. So Simon says, from your experience, looking back to the key moments in your career path so far, what can inspire girls to enter the world of tech?
Such a good question. And I wish I had all the answers to this, because I think that would be amazing. Yeah. I think answers to this question will vary depending on where in this kind of pipeline or this kind of ecosystem of career journeys and career paths that we're interested in. But I guess my first instinct is reflecting back on my experiences when I was making those kind of key and critical decisions, kind of, I guess, at kind of age 16, age kind of 14, in choosing your GCSEs, your A-levels, your O-levels, your whatever it is. And I think there are two key things that come to mind. One of those things is a support network. Technology and engineering are such diverse fields, and even now I'm continuing to learn what it means to be an engineer and a roboticist, and the incredible diversity of roles available within this field. And I think it's really important for young people to have access to people who are confident in talking about what technology and engineering are. And I was lucky enough to have some of those people around me, and it gave me the confidence to explore where within this field I felt like I could work. And it also opened the doors to an understanding that technology is not separate from creativity. They're so interlinked and intertwined. And if you want to be creative, and you want to be creative for the greater good, engineering and technology is one of the ways that you can do this. And not everyone does maths every day. And then I think the other big one that comes to mind is representation. I needed to see engineers who looked like me and valued the things that I valued to feel confident enough to choose engineering and robotics as a field to pursue in my career. One particular instance comes to mind. There was an article in Vogue in 2014, and Jo Da Silva, who is I think a director at Arup now, and it described her work as an engineer but in humanitarian engineering. And for me, that was something that I had never heard of before, and was incredible that you could work for humanity. And little instances like that I can kind of look back on in my career and see little kind of sparks of people where they've broadened my understanding of what engineering was.
Yeah.
And so I think platforming diverse engineers who are doing a huge kind of set of diverse engineering disciplines is really important, and also building those stronger connections to the human, social, environmental dimensions and impacts of the work that these people do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I was at school, and I hope it's improved now, but my school didn't do a particularly good job of making you aware of like what jobs exist. It was like, I remember we did this this quiz where it was supposed to tell you what your future career was going to be, and I feel like it had about 20 different possible jobs. You know, it was like lawyer, architect, teacher.
That's what I got.
And most of the people that I interact with on a day-to-day basis now don't do any of the jobs that were on that original list.
No.
So yeah, I agree. It's important to make these things visible to people.
Definitely.
Ella, it's been great speaking to you today. I've been chatting to Ella Maule, a PhD student at Bristol Robotics Lab. Thanks, Ella.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, I'd really appreciate it if you could share the podcast and leave a review to let us know what you think. And if you've got a question you'd like me to ask one of my future guests, you can contact us on social media at Robot Talk Pod or visit robottalk.org. We regularly announce upcoming guests, and I'd love to include your robotics questions, whether they're super basic, a bit silly, or even quite profound, in my next interview. Next week, I'm talking to Dinesh Tarapur from the University of Southampton, all about fault detection, division of labour, and robot swarms. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.